Hey, welcome everyone. Today I have with me Marsha Acker with Team Catapult. I'm so excited to have her here on the Planners on Purpose podcast. And we are just going to talk leadership today. And I'm very excited to have this conversation with Marsha. She'll tell you a lot about herself. She's very just distinguished and has lots of leadership experience. And I just cannot wait to jump into this conversation. So, Marsha, welcome to the Planners on Purpose podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Naomi. I'm excited to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So I think most of those that are on the podcast will be listening and wondering, who is Marsha Acker? I haven't heard of who Marsha Acker is. So I would love for you to just share a little bit about your journey and
Mm.
what brought you to becoming a leadership and team coach.
Well, I've taken what I would call a pretty circuitous route to what I do today. You know, I've always had, I think, a passion or a calling for how to make things easier for people or how to bring about change. And I think my first approach to that was through technology. So I have a bachelor's and a master's in software engineering, and I kind of got my career start. I found myself bridging a gap between end users and developers, helping them to communicate with one another and sort out like what's the requirement for automating systems. And I think at the time I had a desire that we were going to bring about change through automation and technology and process. But I
Nice.
think it was probably about 8 to 10 years into that space. I had I had been introduced to the skills of facilitation early on, so I started to find myself facilitating conversations with people. That became a pretty big passion of mine about how do we create collaborative spaces and the process to do that. And then I started to realize through lots of things, both through working on projects, but also in my own leadership journey, being given, you know, more responsibility or different positions, that I found myself what I would call out over my skis, a little unsteady or unbalanced in terms of working with other humans. And I
Mhm.
became really fascinated with the process of change and the personal aspects of how change impacts people. And, I found myself leading large, process-led transformations in organizations that were really looking to have massive change, and just noticing that impact that it was having on leadership teams that I was facilitating. And so between that and then also being out over my skis in my own leadership, I took my foundations in facilitation and group process, and I went off to professional coach training because I wanted to develop leadership skills. And I often say I got my world turned around. I saw, lots of different ways about engaging in conversations and engaging with other people. And
Mhm.
that sort of marks the start to when I work with a lot of technologists, people who are in the technology space now, but my passion is around helping leaders work with other humans. Like
Mhm.
I call it the human skills. And so we spend a lot of our time focused on communication.
That's great. And for the record, I think it's very impressive that you're able to talk to teams that are in tech as well and helping them to just see things through, because to me, that's a whole nother language in itself, technology.
Well, I think that, tech, like many other fields, I
Mhm.
find that many of us get to where we are because we have competency in a particular technology or science, or we're really good at what we do. And I think the leadership part of any job starts to require us to need different skills as we
Mhm.
interface more with other humans. And I make up that event planning is one of those fields. Like how do we interface with other humans? That's the whole thing. So
It definitely is. I think with event planning, it is definitely how we interface other humans. It's interesting because there was a article that I read that it was talking about leadership, and one of the trends is really becoming more knowledgeable about humanism and helping to change the behavior, right?
Yeah.
Versus more being on the whole strategy and this is how you do this
Mm,
or that. You can
mm,
have your strategy laid out,
yep.
but if you can't encourage the change
Yeah.
through the behavior, that's what a leader should be able to, I guess, engage
Yeah.
or ignite in their teams.
I find
Mhm.
myself really aligned with that. Like in my experience, it's partly what sits behind why I left the process piece. I thought
Mhm.
it doesn't matter what strategy we have. It doesn't matter what tools we buy. Like if we're not able to come together in face-to-face conversation and for that conversation to be successful and for us to be able to be aware of our own behaviors and the impact we're having on other people, if we can't do that,
Mhm.
it really won't matter what our
Yeah.
strategy is, what our tools are. I think, I would say the same thing I would imagine in event planning as well. Like
Mhm.
it comes down, I think, to that relationship that we're able to build and how are we able to navigate that
Mhm.
that moment when we're talking with other people.
Absolutely. So when we talk about leadership, I know we talked a
Mm,
little bit about a facet or like
mm,
a spectrum of leadership here. But what does leadership truly, I guess, does it mean to you? What would be
mm.
Marsha's definition of what a leader is and what leadership is?
I think leadership is, well, I want to distinguish because I think there is a leader, which is
Mhm.
a role or a position, and I think there is leadership, which is
Mm.
a quality or an attribute. And I
Absolutely. Mhm.
hold a perspective that any of us, a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old can demonstrate leadership, and many of them
Mhm.
are quite adept at it.
Oh yeah. My daughter says that she leads
Yeah,
this house sometimes.
yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think there's something really, something lovely about children in the way that they lead because they don't have all the other stuff that can
Mhm.
sometimes get in our way. But, to me, leadership is, I think it is an art. I There can be science behind it, but I definitely think it's an art of engaging with others and
Mhm.
in a way that helps us all show up to be the best version of ourselves and able to be in and navigate moments when we're not our best selves,
Yeah.
and that we're doing that towards an aligned vision. So, or a shared goal or a shared purpose that we're working
Mhm.
towards. So that's, I think it's about the human side of it.
Mhm. Mhm. And I think that it definitely is. And when you look at, let's say, leaders from just in history, right?
Mm,
A lot of people, they relate to a leader in some way, and a leader pretty much has a specific vision that they're
yeah.
helping people through. And that process, I think, with getting someone from, let's say, that point A to point
Mm,
B is what they're leading them through. It's kind of leading them through. It's like
yeah.
the leader in a ship, right? Leading them through a particular thing. So
I
I
think if you'd
absolutely
ask
agree.
anybody, like, what's the leader that's had the most impact on you, or when
Mhm.
you think about somebody that's had an impact in your life, I think most people will likely tell you
Mhm.
some version of a story about someone that they interacted with that helped them learn or grow. And it might not mean that they had a loving and caring relationship, but I
Mhm.
think a lot of times it's about what was I able to do, when I was interacting with that other person. Where did they stretch me or grow me, or where did I learn something about myself and was able to contribute and make a difference. And so I do
Yeah.
think a lot of it's about working with difference.
Who would that be for you?
Ah, that's a good question. I haven't, I think one of my challenges is that I I think there are older models of leadership, and then I tend to think there are newer, more modern versions of leadership. And so early on in my career, I don't think I had a lot of good examples of what I would call a more modern way of describing even the definition that I've just given you. I think
Mhm.
falls a bit into that space of more modern leadership. But there have been mentors that I've had in my life who I would hold up as that example, like who have really made an impact for
Mhm.
me. They name things, that I
Yeah.
do. They help me see an aspect in a really supportive, champion way, but also to help me see things that maybe I don't really necessarily want to look at that are a little bit harder. But one person in particular stands out for me as just really super appreciating candid feedback and ongoing relationship that always felt like it's in support of
Mhm.
me, like a champion.
Someone who's for you, right? And
Hmm.
for where you're for where you are,
Yep.
wherever you are. So
Yep.
that's really great. Do you have a particular moment that, let's say, you felt shaped or
Mhm.
defined you as a leader?
There's so this is a moment, it actually occurred many years ago. So it was early on in my career, and it absolutely shaped me. And it is partly what sits underneath the work that I do today. So I was early on in my career, I had just been promoted into an executive leadership role in an organization that I was in. We were a small startup, so I think we were about 150 people. And I was given some feedback so I had been in that role for maybe a month or so. And the CEO came in one day and said, I'm really not sure about you being in this position. I'm
Mhm.
not experiencing the gravitas that I would expect from someone in this role.
Mhm.
And I remember being like really having the wind knocked out of me, completely devastated by the feedback. And more importantly, not understanding what in the world that meant. I remember going home and looking
Gravitas.
up what does that mean? And I spent weeks trying to sort out, well, what would I be doing? What am I doing that's making you say that? And what would I be doing if I were demonstrating that? What does that look like? So I had all sorts and kinds of questions. And I think I got really, spun around about that. I wasn't quite sure how to action it. And I think at some point I just let it go. And I was like, well, I am who I am. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Not quite sure how to action that feedback. And it was about 2 months later, back in the same office, having a feedback conversation with the CEO, who then said to me, I want to tell you, I got it wrong. I think you are different than what I see other leaders doing, but no less impactful.
Mhm.
And so the way that I would describe that today, like given the language and what I know, is that we had different models of leadership. We have different behavioral models and different ways of leading. And so what was happening was a model clash. There was a way that the CEO would lead, there was a way that I was leading, they were different. And without the ability to kind of describe what the difference was, I think it's so common. I see this in organizations all the time. Then I'm going to give you feedback from my model about how
Mhm.
I think it would look. And I'm going to expect you to action that. And then we don't have a way to really make sense of it or talk about it or really name what the difference is. And so I work with a lot of leaders to onboard, I call it reading the room, but onboard a
Mhm.
way, kind of a technology of making sense of conversation and how we
Yeah.
behave so that we can talk about it, but also so that we can grow tolerance for difference.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't always mean that just because we're different, that it's any less impactful. So that moment shaped me for sure.
Mhm.
For years to come, I would still be, noodling on what happened. And I see that pattern repeat itself over and over again in organizations.
I mean, it happens, right? Because I feel some leaders, they feel as though their perspective of
Mm.
who should lead should fit in, let's say, a particular box that they created.
Yeah.
Some of that I think is really driven on personality. And some of it, are all characteristics of, you
Yeah.
know, leadership too. But I definitely do see that as well. I probably am a different leader than
Mm.
another person. I think also what helps too is for an individual to know who they are,
Mm.
how they lead, be confident, right? And in that, so that they can educate others on the type of leader they are, and just be confident, right, in how they get people
Yeah.
get people through. Because if you don't know, then sometimes it's really tough to
Yeah.
take that feedback, right? So there was a person who I work with, it was a client, and it was really interesting how he, I guess, described me,
Mm.
talked about how I was calm and I took on
Mm.
all of the, let's say, chaos of the event
Yeah.
with ease. But
Yeah.
that's me. It's the
Yeah.
calm, it's the ease, it's the steady, it's the loyal. It's different than, let's say,
Hmm.
other people would be co-leader. So it's interesting that you say that, because I do feel like it's
Yeah.
different for each person, and
Yeah.
it's nice to be able to show people who they are as a leader, to see
Yeah.
how that can, I don't know, have an effect on how they lead.
So, Naomi, what you're articulating is what's in both your behavioral model and what's in your model for leadership. And I think that that is the work to do. I think it's the work for all of us to do, is can we be
Mhm,
really clear about how we behave? Like, can we name it, describe it? And then can we also be clear about how we lead, what is in our model for leadership? Not, and I think the act of doing that, I think many of us could tell you what we do, but
mhm,
not as many of us can tell you why we do it. And so I think that's where the clarity and calmness comes from in our ability to lead, is having done some of that internal work to name it for ourselves, so that
mhm,
when you encounter the person that has a different model, it's an easy way of just saying,
mhm.
I'm not right and you're not wrong, or vice versa. It's just we're different. And can we name it? Can we talk about where there might be some challenges in the intersection of it? But we get to we get to be different. I think what you're describing, I love. It's one of the things that I talk a lot about, is defining your model for leadership.
And I've seen so many people, not to say get passed over, but
Mm.
they're not quite understood. Just when it comes to like coaching other people, it's like they're not quite understood for the person that they are, or
Mm.
let's say that person has a little bit more growth to do to be confident and kind of like that leader that they are. And, it's really hard to see someone not understand them
Yes,
and then
yes,
get them to a point where it's like, okay, now you know who you are, you know
mm,
how you lead, you know how you impact others, and
yeah,
you know how you can speak to others and, encourage them to change behavior.
yep,
I think that that's also something that's really
mm,
be great to see
mm,
to see it in other people, to identify where you can help others too, which is,
yeah,
I'm sure, kind of what you do in your business as well.
yeah, yep. I agree with you.
So what would you think that the biggest struggle that you
Mm.
see in your coaching and facilitation? Because I know you work with a lot of tech companies and probably other
Yeah.
companies, and you see teams struggle, leaders struggle.
Mm,
What is the major one that you would
mm.
think they struggle with?
You know, I can trace, part of it is the lens that I look through, right? So much
Mhm,
of my lens is behavioral and
mhm,
communication, but I can take just about any situation that teams are challenged with. I think today teams are often dealing with, like, it shows up as a breakdown in communication, or people will say we have this one, leadership teams are infamous for saying we have this one difficult person who's on the team and we are trying to work together as a leadership team, or warring factions on leadership teams, like someone that owns marketing and someone that owns operations, sort of dueling it out for scarce resources, and kind of taking that perspective. So I think there are often teams today are faced with constant uncertainty and complexity. And so I think there's lots of small things that start to show up as breakdowns in a team. I could trace all of it back to behavior. Like there will be a behavioral kind of structural story to what's happening in the conversation that then manifests itself as a breakdown in a team or a difficult person. And so I think the biggest thing I just always come back to, do we make space to think and talk together as a team? Or are we just so busy running down the road that we can't get in the car in order to help things go faster? So I think we all, I'd put myself in that boat, believe that we are excellent at communication because we do it all day, every day. But I think the biggest challenge is that in that communication, we assume that everybody sees the same reality that we do. And the fact is that we'll see really different realities. So like, as you and I have been talking about, someone who has a behavioral model, a leadership model that maybe values pace and calmness, intersecting with someone who has a different behavioral model that values action and pace. Like the challenge will be that those two individuals are going to think and talk together differently. Like sometimes that will be serving, the difference will be serving, and other times the difference will actually be separating. And so how do we name it so that we can work through it and value the difference?
So then I would say we are running down. We're probably on like a speeding train going, just going.
Yeah.
How do we make that time to have those conversations to make sure that we're aligned and we're talking, the same language? Because I feel like that does happen all of the time. People they're warring, but because we have, let's say, a project that we have to do right now, we don't have time to really deal with that elephant in the room or that bigger conversation. So how can teams do that a little bit more frequently or better work with having those conversations?
I'll share a story about my own team. So within Team Catapult, we have a value around that. And shortly after the pandemic started, what we experienced was lots of growth, and growth brought more pace, more busyness, needed for more capacity. So everything just continued to expand. And then what I started to realize is that what some space we had for communication was really going away. And the story about, if you've ever heard the thing about taking the jar and putting the big rocks in first, the things that are the most important, and then you fill in with other things. The calendar, I felt like we were just at the mercy of a calendar, and it was really running the show. And it became super impossible to schedule any block of time beyond 30 minutes with everybody. So what we did, we went out as far as we had to. I think we had to go out about 6 months. And I just started finding, the first Thursday of every month, I found a time, and we started blocking off a half day. And over the last 3 years, it's become our norm. We now have the first Thursday of every month is a half day container to hold relationship building. So there's no agenda, there's no facilitator. It's really about using that time to come together and talk about the things that we really need to talk about and actually slow the pace. Because there were plenty of meetings that we had that had agendas and time boxes, and we had to keep moving. We didn't have time. Like something would happen, in a relationship or between one of us, and then there was no time to clean it up or follow up. And then conversations were going offline. And that's another principle that we have, is to bring conversations online rather than take them, one-on-one. So that's how we did it. But I think that any structure like the question becomes, how do you put structure? How do you make it a big rock and something that you
Mhm.
prioritize ahead of time? Because life will absolutely take over.
Yeah. And how do you keep that block on the
Yeah.
calendar and not let
Yeah.
it, bow down to
Yes.
the mercy of other
Yep.
meetings too, I think. So
That's
it's great that you have it consistent and
yeah.
it's now a pattern, right?
And we preserve it.
Mhm.
There are only a couple of times where, somebody has a conflict, and then they just step out and we keep going. But yeah,
Mhm.
we preserve it pretty well.
That's good. I know you talked about relationship building. How does that
Mm,
look like? What are your suggestions and tips for if they were to have, let's say, a space or a container to
yeah.
build relationship and have these conversations that we don't get a chance to have? Like, how does that look for someone?
I think with teams, talking about values, what we value, I love it, like even in our conversation, you and I have been pulling out bits and pieces, but I love what you were saying about valuing, getting things done, but also being the calm, the storm. And so I think as a team, being able to identify what are our individual values and then what do we collectively value? Because sometimes there might be some difference between those two things. And when we have those values, part of that time together can be defining them and then checking in on them. Like,
Mhm.
how are we living into this? What happened over the last 3 weeks or the last 2 weeks where we feel like we want to celebrate, where we really lived into these? And what are some of the places where we didn't? And what created that? And how do we feel about it? And so I think, those kinds of conversations, I think values conversations are great. The other piece about building trust will be, can we talk, can we say what's really true for us? Like, can
Mhm.
I show up to that space and say, I'm not enjoying the process, or I'm not enjoying the work right now, and here's why. In the language that we use, we would talk about welcoming people to bystand on themselves, like bring a morally neutral comment about what's
Mhm.
happening for them or for the system. And so we really invite people to sort of name those things, because then if they're named, we can all, it's not about pointing blame
Mhm.
or fingers, or saying to someone, hey, I'm not enjoying this because you. But I
Right.
think if we can surface it, then we can talk about it and it becomes kind of a property of the team.
And I mean, and the organization, I guess, has to be able to create that safe space, or
Yeah.
the people that are there have to create that safe space so that they trust that
Yep.
what they say is going to be held in high integrity and it's going to
Yes.
not go outside the confines of that space. And
Yep.
but I think that if that can happen in a safe space, I think that's definitely a really great, step in the right direction, and consistently having that conversation too. I think when we move so fast, it's really hard for us to have those conversations. But I guess the consequence of that is, a year passes and so much has changed, and
Yeah.
or
That's
people leave and you don't know why, and it's because
yeah.
there was that struggle that
Yeah.
wasn't addressed. Mhm.
I think that it's such a, and I fall into this too, but it's like this false trap of progress. I think it's easy to believe the metaphor of running down the road too busy to get in the car is actually feedback that was given to me many years ago when I just kept resisting something that a mentor at the time was telling me. And I'm like, I don't have time. And he finally said, you're telling me that you're too busy running down the road to get in the car that I'm offering you. And I
Mm.
thought, well, that's
That's a way to put it.
really true. So I go to that metaphor frequently. It's my way of reminding myself that I think it can be an artificial, it's like artificial progress sometimes. If we
Mhm.
keep going at that pace and not creating place where we can like slow it down, reflect. What you're talking about is, creating the rules around how we're gonna, hold that space and how confidentiality would be held. So I think
Mhm.
that conversation is really important too. But without it, I watch this happen every day in teams that I'm working with, where they too are running at the pace of business that's required today, stepping on one another, stepping over one another, stepping over big topics. And it sort of piles up as undiscussables that sort of get tossed under the rug. And you can think about a colleague of mine uses the metaphor of like sweeping so much under the rug that eventually the team trips over the rug every time they come in to, work as a team together. And so, and I've watched, I've watched teams break apart because of that. I've watched organizations break apart because the two executives that were sort of co-leading couldn't communicate with one another. They just kept talking past each other. So I think there's a real value that it's some of those assumptions we make about communication that we're good at it. And I actually would hold that it's a skill and a competency. And if we don't carve out some of the space to develop that muscle, we run the risk of like taking on a lot of work and a lot of responsibility and sort of spinning, I think in one place.
This is bringing up so much. So in the event planning world, what has been happening is that we just have had a unique opportunity. Obviously, the last few years were very tough. So now, into 2022, coming into 2023, it's hot and heavy. Events are coming in. However, we do see, and I feel like this is happening across different industries. It's not just event planning, but it's a big struggle because we were the last industry really to get back in action. So now we have a lot of turnover, not necessarily been able to get all of our people back that, let's say, had to, that we're not able to kind of work all the way through. But then also people are just different now. The pandemic has changed people. They have different priorities, different expectations. So leaders now have to find the right person amidst all of that and continue to educate and bring people on and on board, which is always it's really hard because you need at least, I say, 6 months before a person is feeling comfortable and really feeling like they're really integrated well into an organization. So I guess I would love to hear just your insight on that, if you've worked with leaders struggling with that, and how can they get more, I guess, more fresh air for the journey? Because for some leaders, they've just been working steadily through. Now there's just then talk about change management. Now there's just the next thing that they have to work through the change. And sometimes that can be very daunting. It can be tiring to just continue to just be pushing that stone up a hill. I would love to just hear your insights into just that struggle that we're going through right now.
I just as you say all of that about, what's happened to the industry, I have a lot of empathy for all workers in that space, like both leading and, supporting it. So I think, a couple of things that I'd say about change and looking at it at a more systemic view of what's happening, what's the behavior. I'm always, when things are going on, I remember like in the heart of the pandemic, I kept thinking, okay, so this has been totally disrupted. The tablecloth's been ripped out from the table and the dishes went all up in the air.
Table's broken.
Right, the table is broken. There's no table to put the dishes on anymore.
Right.
I just keep wondering, like, what could we create from what's happening? So, I think it was Buckminster Fuller who said you can't fight existing reality. The way to bring about change is to build a new model. And like I think I'm that's not totally word for word, but that's the gist of what he said. And I think about when everything feels like it's upturned or nothing can go back. It's a little bit of wanting to go back to what it was and potentially a call forward to create something new. Like I think we can either resist change that's happening, like systemic change. You can either feel like you're being subsumed or the victim of it, or to get on top of it to say, okay, so here's the reality. this is happening here. I have these kinds of people. I can't find these kinds of people anymore. And what might we create from it? And I think that, I talk about creating space in teams on a monthly basis. I think partly sometimes that's part of the conversation to have is if we pulled multiple minds together, what might we create from what's happening? How do we work with what's here rather than pushing against it or trying to go back to the way it was? So just at a principle level, I think those are sometimes the way I think about change. And then just a lot of empathy for, I think one of the things that I want so much for leaders today is just a bit of grace and space, self-care I think we have yet to fully understand the impact of what the last 3 to 4 years have had on all of us. I think we're still, coming out of this space. The world has changed. Yes, I think people value different things. They want different things. They want different things in their work world. So I wonder what's possible.
And I like what you're saying, taking where you are now and creating and making anew. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity if you see it to be able to do that right now, instead of let's try to make it and mold it back to what it was 2018, 2019. It's a new day. Let's see how we can build on this versus trying to break it down again or go against the grain.
There's a personal component of that, right? Which will be, if I put myself in the shoes of someone who might still be holding on to that, I might be thinking right now, well, hold on a minute. I don't know how to work in a new world. I know the old one, or I was really good at it. That was a competency and a capability that I had, and I had a lot of confidence there. I knew how to navigate that. And I think this happens for any of us, which is, well, what will the new world look like and how will I contribute to it? And will I be of value in that space? Or will I feel like I'm out over my skis and I don't really know how to work in that space? So I think that's both an example of the individual change that will be happening. How do people have space to sort of work through their own process to that? And then there's the larger systemic view of what's happening. And I'm a big proponent of involving people in change, having a collaborative process so that people can sort out, okay, that's no longer going to exist. So I've got to get myself on board to a new way of working and a new idea. Maybe I can be part of thinking together about how that's going to happen.
Right. And on the individual level, I'm always about, well, what excites you, what delights you, what is something that you do want to contribute and be passionate about, so that you are in that wheelhouse of contributing in that larger way. Because quite frankly, even during the pandemic, I know for events, they went virtual for a while. There were some event planners that were like, this is not this isn't for me. And unfortunately, because they couldn't find any opportunities, they said, okay, well, I'm just have to do something a little different that excites me. And sometimes that's what happens. But it's important as an individual for they to be aligned as well and to bring in them in the conversation. So what is consequences that you see leaders struggling with if they don't embrace change? Because we do have some leaders that are like, oh, well, it was like this in 2019, or they just kind of are really stuck on how it was before, and some of those things are valid probably within an organization. Sometimes there are consequences for leaders not moving forward.
I think there's individual consequences of just burnout. I mean, you can only resist, or anytime you feel like, I often say this to facilitators and coaches and leaders that we're working with, anytime you feel like you are efforting more than others, like you're trying to take us back to where we were or advocate really strongly for something, I think it's a place to just, for any of us to check. I do this frequently myself. Like where am I holding on to something
Mm,
actually too tightly?
mm,
And there's work for me to do to just let it go. Like what
yeah.
would happen if I let go of the idea that things have to be a
Mhm,
certain way? So I think there's an individual toll that it
mhm,
takes, both on well-being, energy, joy,
mhm,
all of those. And then I think there's a larger, like, systemic look at, event plan. Like if we take the concept of event planning for the moment, like where might it go? How might it adapt and evolve to be something different than it was before, but no less valuable?
mhm. Absolutely. I like that. I always think of that often, gripping,
Mm,
gripping something so tight that
yeah.
it's sometimes it's really you can feel the tension in the
Yep.
grip versus if you're just
Yep.
open-handed and you're giving and you're
Yes.
receiving.
I
Yeah.
think my metaphor that I mentally, it's like, when is my petulant child showing up? Like where
Yeah.
I've dug my heels in
Yes.
like my 3-year-old used to do.
Hmm.
And like I don't want to do that, because I
Hmm.
think there's just data in the inquiry of
Hmm.
that. Like where's that coming from? And what is it? Who's that about, Marsha? And
So I know we're wrapping up, but there's a couple other questions I had for you. One specifically in regards to women in leadership. And
mm,
the reason why I want to ask about this is because for event professionals in our space, there's a lot more when you just look at the dynamics of, you know, women versus men, there are a lot more women there are men there. However, when you look at, let's say, C-level, where you see more men in that space.
mm,
So I would love to hear your thoughts on like why women struggle still in getting
mm,
into these spaces and what, let's say, can women do in order to have more accessibility into that
yeah.
C-suite.
Mm. Well, I think it's a systemic question. So I don't think there's any one particular, I don't think there's any one action that we're going to take that's going
Right.
to, move that. But again, I go back to behavior. So the example
Mhm,
that I gave of getting feedback about gravitas,
mhm,
I could definitely make up a story. So that was coming from a male leader to a female leader. So I could definitely create my story that says there was maybe some gender difference in that. But I
mhm,
think in so much of what I see, it is we do not, in corporate America, there is this global, I know we're striving, I think, and I do think some organizations are moving the needle on valuing difference in the workplace. And we have lots of ways of valuing difference. For me, when I say valuing difference, I'm talking about behavioral difference. Like, how do
mhm,
we make it okay to talk about, one of the things that I work with teams a lot on is valuing the language of affect, like care and concern for others. And
mhm,
that language is missing in corporate America often. Like
mhm,
we value the language of making meaning of something, and we value the language of power and action, but there's actually a third language, which is the language of affect. And that's not to say, what I don't want to do is draw too many distinctions between gender and the language of affect, because that's not a help that's not true, nor is it helpful.
right.
I think it is a systemic property of organizations and corporate, certainly American business, that we've sort of stripped it out of our language, and we say things like it's work, not personal, or see someone else about that, or leave that baggage at home. I actually don't think that that's helpful. And that's just one example of where I think we need to talk more about valuing different behaviors, having a value for difference in the workplace, and not judging things that look different. And
Mhm,
I think that's a place to start.
mhm, mhm. No, I think that's great. And I think we all have to start somewhere. So I think as long as there's just that awareness,
Yeah.
that's there, and just again continuing to have those conversations and not
Yeah.
sweeping them under the rug. It just kind of helps us all get to a place that we're all just understanding each other and just understanding what needs to be brought in, what types of
Yep.
conversations, as you were saying, needs to be brought into the workplace. How can we humanize it a little bit
Yep.
more, so that it just feels a little bit better
Mm.
for everyone.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
so thank you. So are there anything, I guess, any other notes on leadership maybe that we didn't go over that you want to
Mm.
share with the listeners today?
Mm. Just, I think my parting thought would be where you and I were pointing earlier, which is I believe that there is so much to be gained
Mhm.
from being able to articulate not only how you behave, but also your model for leadership and how you lead change. And I think the definition of those is a little bit of about understanding why you do, what you believe about how change happens. You've heard me say today, like, I believe that you can't force it. I believe you have to work with things that are showing up. I think that it's conversational. I think that change happens when we're able to communicate with people who are different than we are, and from the conversation new ideas emerge. So you're hearing me articulate mine, but it doesn't mean that that's what other people will view. So there's all kinds of ways to lead and lead change. I just think that the work to do as leaders is to define what your model is. So
Mm, absolutely. Thank you. Well,
yeah.
I think those are great words to wrap up on. Thank you so much. I would love to be able to just talk a little bit about Team Catapult
Mm,
and what you're doing there, what is on the horizon for you and your team. Share with us. We would love to hear
yeah.
more.
Yeah. Well, our space is leadership development. So we have open workshops for facilitators and coaches, event planners that really focus on facilitation skills. And then also, it's a language we call reading the room, so making behavioral change happen. So we have workshops like that. And then we do a lot of work with teams, so leadership teams and tech teams, helping them learn build the muscle of communication and becoming autonomous in it. So we
Okay.
really want to build the competency for teams so that they can do the work ongoing. And so that is our whole purpose in life.
Well, that's wonderful. That's great.
Yeah.
And we can find all of those workshops at teamcatapult.com, correct? Is
Yes.
that the
Yes, you got it.
perfect? Which
Yeah.
I'll link in the description for everyone. So,
Okay.
Marsha, before we definitely wrap up, I just want to ask you just a few quick hit questions.
Okay.
I do this with every guest. I promise they're not, too too intrusive or crazy. But I just wanted to just get to know you a little bit more. So the first one that I have for you is let's say, what did you do this long Memorial Day weekend?
Mm. Well, one of the things that I did, which I love, is I read a non-workbook on my
Oh,
back porch with a nice glass of iced tea.
okay. Sounds good. I like that. Sweetened or unsweetened iced tea?
Unsweetened.
Unsweetened. That's what I do too. So I'm a fan of the unsweetened iced tea. So my next question would be about what do you and your teams do at Team Catapult to
Mm,
relax and refresh? What is your favorite activity to do with your team to just
mm.
refresh them?
Well, some of our monthly call is really one of the things that I have come to love and appreciate. So I actually look forward to it. It's coming up next week. But we also go yearly to a place at the beach and we do a week-long retreat. And so
Okay,
that is coming up in November and I
nice.
look forward to it. It's just it's a lovely time to just relax and build connections, but also not have a fully planned day.
That's awesome. I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
Anything with like beach and water, that's it.
I'm with you. Yes.
So I hope you enjoy that. And lastly, what is your favorite place that you've traveled that you would highly recommend or you would want to go back again?
Mm. There's a part of my heart that lies down in the British Virgin Islands, so it's in the
Oh,
Caribbean. We've been down there multiple times. I love sailing, so we often will charter a sailboat and do a bareboat charter down on the BVI. So
no, that sounds nice.
yes, that's my place.
That's your place. Well, that's
Mhm.
great. So thank you. That sounds great. You sound like just like you have lots of fun in the sun, and I totally love that.
I do.
That's great. Well, thank you again for being on the Planners on Purpose podcast. Before we get
Mhm.
out of here, other than teamcatapult.com, do you want to just share where to find you on any other platform?
Yes. So you can find me on LinkedIn. The best way, Marsha Acker, and just shoot me a quick message to tell me how you found me. And then I'm pretty responsive within about 24 hours of connecting with people. And you can also, I have a podcast called Defining Moments of Leadership. So you can find that at teamcatapult.com. And I have a new book out called Build Your Model for Leading Change. And you can find that at buildyourmodel.com.
Perfect. Well, we have a book club too. We might have to have your book on our book club, Marsha, and have you back. So,
Awesome.
well, perfect. Well, it's been wonderful speaking with you. Thank you so much for just sharing just your leadership insights and expertise. And thank you so much for being on.
Thanks, Naomi, for having me. I have loved the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.